Good evening. My name is Rodney Jordan, and this is my TED Talk for our Diversity in Education class with Dr. Shepard Jones as our professor. Um, I've learned a lot from this class. As I'm talking about a TED Talk, I feel like I should be on the stage with a black background and a laser pointer, with my data on the screen. But it's here. It's just me here on the video, and my PowerPoint will be accompanying this documentation. But I want to talk about for my topic uh, creating culturally sensitive classrooms and educational environments. As a locale for my particular concept of choice, I'm using the school district that I was a part of, the DeKalb County School District, and I'm using student survey data that's separate from our student health survey data required by the state, but just internal student data as it relates to their educational environment. And so we are a district that serves over 147,000 children, over 39 different ethnicities, nationalities, as it relates to our demographics. However, there is a great divide, as I would kind of coin the term, a great divide, which means that students of an advantaged socioeconomic status would be on the north side of the county, a very diverse population of students, and students that are categorized as low socioeconomic students would be on the south side of the county, and pretty much the majority, although there is some level of diversity, you're talking about between 95 and 97 percent African Americans. The survey data that came out recently was very disturbing. So, as part of locations, I'm talking about the entire district encompassing all elementary schools, all middle schools, as well as all high schools. And the issue has to do with students feeling that their school environment is not at all culturally sensitive. There was, as reported to us by district personnel, there was a 27% increase in bullying incidents in the 18-19 school year from the 17-18 school year. So, which means that bullying is spiked, and it's also the highest as it has been since data has been recorded for CCRPI. That's going to about 2014. And with that, our director of student relations and pupil services has informed us that over 80% over 80% of bullying incidences is tied to some type of cultural insensitivity, whether that be a student's religion, whether that be a student's place of origin, their nationality, whether it be that student's economic status. All of these things are a part of culture. When you talk about language, when you talk about clothing, when you talk about potential hairstyles, when you talk about where we've been, where we've come from, all of these things are a part of our culture. And the data has now shown us that we are not being effective enough as a district when it comes to creating a culturally sensitive educational environment. And so we have to put our heads together as educators and determine how do we fix this issue. Because as a first year principal and as an educational leader, we always hear the phrase closing the achievement gap. You know, we always hear all of this jargon as it relates to the teaching and the learning process. We hear all of these things about lesson plans and more rigor in the classroom and rigor and relevance and this initiative and that initiative and this software and that software. And it's all about instruction. But we have to step back and realize that many of our students have barriers to learning before you can even have a conversation about the instruction that they receive and the learning that takes place inside of the classroom. And feeling culturally comfortable is going to be one of those barriers that has to be addressed in order for us to have more successful classrooms. So around 2008, there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Baruti Kafele, who is considered one of the greatest turnaround principles in the Northeast, and he coined the phrase "closing the attitude gap." And closing the attitude gap was simply a reference to inspiration and motivation as it relates to students in education. And what he's saying is before you can even get to the process of talking about teaching and learning, before you can get to the process of talking about academics, you've got to first fix the attitude problem that we have, because there are some students that simply don't care. They're not motivated. They're uninspired. And so I would like to even draw off of that concept, and I would like to pose the concept within this presentation of closing the culture gap. In other words, we have to address the concept of culture and become culturally sensitive in our classroom and educational environments before we can ever get the effectiveness that we're looking for as it relates to our students. So within the framework of my answer to this great question, in hindsight, looking at the concepts that we learned in this class, looking at the assignments that we've had, looking at the discussions that we've had, I want to narrow down creating a culturally sensitive educational environment into 5 manageable steps. These are going to be 5 ways that you can help create a culturally sensitive classroom environment. Number 1 is simply to get to know all of your students as individuals. I know that as good educators, we invest all the time and effort to get to know our students. Relationships are really the bedrock of the foundation of good teaching in any classroom. As an educator from day one, my number 1 priority was always building generative relationships. This becomes even more important when teaching in a culturally diverse school, which is increasing every day because America now is a melting pot. Students have unique skills and experiences, and they can enrich your classroom culture. We've got to begin to take time to understand what students value, as well as their strengths and needs. We've definitely got to partake in and engage in conversations. Give students surveys or ask questions or exit slips, learn about their hobbies, their interests, and you can tap into those things when you're planning your lessons. It's important to make a strong effort to understand each student as a unique and complex individual beyond his or her cultural identity. This will help you create hooking and engaging lessons that can bridge cultural barriers. We just got to learn who we have in the classroom. That's why I think it was so appropriate and befitting that the first assignment in this class, in our diversity class, was to do a cultural paper on ourselves. And looking at my own and looking at what I put down on paper, and then I attached some illustrations to it, it's like it made it come alive, and I was able to see the culture of my own life, right there in black and white. Step number 2, we've got to make sure our curriculum is culturally varied and relevant. In other words, it's very common for teachers to fall into the habit focusing exclusively on Western artists. If you were to use an art teacher as an example, artists like Picasso or Van Gogh or Rembrandt, these are all wonderful artists, but we have to understand they are not the only group of artists that students should be exposed to in art class. After you've taken the time to get to know your students, it will be much easier to come up with the craft projects that connect to their identities and their unique personal interests. For example, if you have a student that's, from a particular country, and you might be covering that particular unit in a class, ask that student to share, be inquisitive, want to genuinely learn about the culture of that student. If you are a school that has diverse demographics in your building, and one of Mr. Baruti Kafele's books, Motivating Black Males to Achieve, he talked about having pictures around the school of successful people that looked like his students. Well, if you're 100% African American, that's easy. But if you're a diverse school, you've got to have some, pictures of successful African American, pictures of successful Asian Americans, pictures of, you have to Every demographic within your building or within your educational context should be able to look at something in the atmosphere and make a connection with it to see that their environment is culturally sensitive. Now, number three is a very difficult one to swallow. Number three is simply we've got to be aware of our own cultural biases. As educators, we set the tone for our classroom. If you're a leader, you set the tone for your building. We are responsible for defining what is embraced. We are responsible for defining what is encouraged. And this is a big job, and it requires we be aware of any biases that we may carry into our educational environments. I was at a conference about 2 weeks ago, and I heard a principal refer to a specific ethnic group, and he stated that he was depending on that ethnic group's to boost his CCRPI scores. And to some, that may seem complimentary, but it's not. It's actually a cultural bias that we definitely want to be careful of. We got to ask ourselves, where do you feel you need to grow in terms of your own cultural sensitivity? Although this type of reflection is often uncomfortable, it's very important. Just like we expect our students to be open to the discomfort of the learning process, we as educators have to be open to the discomfort of the culturally sensitive process. We've got to reflect openly, we've got to reflect honestly, and make efforts to correct any cultural biases that we may find. Number four is simply to seek input and support from community members. Look around your school and community. Are there teachers or parents or guardians who will make great collaborators? Tap into this expertise, tap into this resource of other members of our learning community to help us meet the needs of our diverse student population. For example, is there a parent who would make a great guest speaker? Do you know a teacher who has lived in another country or has a deep understanding of a culture that your class might be currently studying? You can maybe ask them to share what they know with your students. These experiences would almost surely provide your students with deeper and more authentic learning that you may be able to provide yourself. I always make it a point, if I could even drive the point back home, look at every demographic that's represented in your educational atmosphere and be able to provide connections in the cultural climate of that building to where every demographic can connect with and feel that you're making an effort at being culturally sensitive. And the last one is to make sure students have a choice to create authentic work. One of the things that I'm working on as a first-year principal is the type of work that we begin to give our students. When students have choice, they feel validated and they feel empowered to create. We've got to allow students to use their own stories and experiences to make work that expresses their uniqueness. This will create an opportunity for your lessons to transcend any kind of cultural barriers because students feel empowered and they feel like their individual culture is valued. As educators, we play a key role in teaching our students cultural tolerance and understanding. When students are given the freedom to share their own perspectives, cultural barriers will surely be broken down and lines of communications are opened. And so I've broken this down into 5 easy to manage strategies because the data that came from my local context as it relates to the entire school system was amazing. The staggering statistic was only 3% of students in the school district felt that their educational environments were culturally sensitive or met their needs from a cultural standpoint, and that data cannot be tolerated. We've got to have more dialogues, we've got to do more, we've got to look at more research, and we've got to put in place more strategies and practices that will let our students know that we are definitely putting in an effort to be more culturally sensitive. We are definitely putting in an effort to know who you are, to understand you, and to remove as many barriers as humanly possible for you as an individual student to be successful in the teaching and learning process. These issues were important to me because as a middle school principal, bullying is a hot topic, and bullying is something that, I definitely want to nip in the bud in my building. And seeing that over 80% of the bullying issues that took place could be tied back to something that was dealing with a student's culture was very, very, very disturbing, because bullying disrupts the learning process. And so what that's really saying is we have students that cannot learn, or they're not have full concentration on learning because there are classmates or there are people in that building that refuse to be sensitive to their culture, or refuse to accept students for the individuals that they are. And so it's a local issue where you have an external issue that's impacting the local school environment. So in conclusion, if we can begin to each one teach one. If everybody can individually begin to assess themselves as it relates to cultural sensitivity, this 5-step manageable plan can be an awesome springboard into holistically attacking cultural sensitivity in our environment. Again, my name is Rodney Jordan, and this is my TED Talk for Diversity in Education. Thank you.